So I want to start by asking about a recent case that made it to some of the American media. Tell us about that particular Kurdish prisoner who tested positive for COVID-19. Where is he? How is he doing? I believe he's your client.
Yes, so I have a 25-year-old Kurdish client that's currently in Otay Mesa Detention Center in San Diego, California. He crossed the border in February 5th, and ever since then, we were waiting for his credible fear interview, which is the first process for claiming asylum in the US. Once that was finished, COVID was becoming very serious in the US. Of course, at the beginning, we kept brushing it under the rug and claiming it wasn't a big deal, according to the administration, but it was getting serious. So I was petitioning with ICE, the Immigration Custom Enforcement, to parole him, to basically just let him be out of the detention centers where it's a hot spot for coronavirus. But it wasn't very helpful. ICE did not really respond to my request. I called and called, but it was no avail. Eventually, I put the motion in with the immigration court in San Diego, and that was granted last week.
Right. So, Samir, I don't want to ask much about the inmates, background and identifiable information. But what can you tell us about this particular inmate? Where is he from? Why is he in a detention center? How did he make it to this detention center?
Sure. So he's a 25-year-old Kurdish guy from Bakur, southeast Turkey. He came through Tijuana, Mexico, and he was apprehended in like maybe 50 miles outside of Tijuana on the US border. And upon apprehension, he was obviously taken to the detention center, and he has been kept there since while we pursue his asylum claim.
And so he's obviously claiming asylum here in the U.S. What's the case? Why is he claiming asylum? And are these kind of cases common here in the U.S. now?
Yes. So him being of Kurdish background, growing up in Turkey with the persecution that goes on there, he has base with religion. He has a relief based on his ethnic group, political membership, membership in a social group. So all of these are basis for his asylum relief. And his was just mainly because he was very active with the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, HDP. And he came through Mexico and unfortunately got apprehended.
Okay, so he came from Mexico, and then how long ago did he? I want to move back to the main topic that we were talking about, COVID-19. How long ago did you find out that he has COVID-19? Do you know how he contracted the illness, or what's the circumstances around his COVID-19?
I found out April 10th. I'm sorry, actually, I found out April 12th because he was tested on the 10th. I called him and he actually called me. It's very hard to get in contact with clients once they're in detention, but he did call me. He said he wasn't feeling well, but he just thought it was a cold, which was very common for him. He gets sick all the time. But they tested him. I guess he showed some types of symptoms. They did test him, and then 2 days later, he was tested positive for COVID. But I was never informed. I actually found out a few days later through my clients.
Is that something normal that you, as representing the client, how does that kind of work? Does the authorities, prison authorities usually, or detention center authorities usually let you know when there's an issue with your client, or was it in this particular case, it was different? The way they handled the process was different?
So typically, patient privacy is protected by HIPAA, which is the health protection privacy here in the US. But with this case, because I had already petitioned for his release, so my petition was basically based on a humanitarian parole just in case he can contract COVID. So it wasn't even about him catching it, like him actually being positive, but I didn't want him to even get it or be exposed to it. So I felt that it was urgent for at least the ICE officer that's in charge of his case to inform me about his current state, because it would have, of course, made a big difference for my petition to have him released.
And in your conversation with him, does it look like Was there enough precaution and measures taken at the detention center for him not to contract the virus, or does he think like there wasn't enough measures taken and put in place at the time for him to be safe inside the detention center?
So initially, when he was apprehended in February, again, the seriousness of COVID was not very like well talked about. Nobody was really discussing it. So being in detention center and getting COVID, he's still like, even when I spoke with him on the phone, he was very calm about it. He was like, "Yeah, I tested positive," and I was like, "Well, it's kind of a big deal," but I didn't want him to panic. So, I mean, he was fine, he was recovering, but unfortunately, it's inadequate medical care in ICE. I mean, this is well known. Even before COVID, there was other breakouts through the detention centers that were not handled properly. People died. When I spoke with him, he said that it's just once a day, a nurse comes in for like 10 minutes, checks his vitals, and then leaves. But what was worrisome was that he does share a dorm room with another client of mine that's also Bakurdi. And because my client had tested positive, the chances of the roommate, who's also my client, having it was also very likely. So I did call the detention center and I said, well, he was obviously exposed to it. He should be quarantined, but he's not quarantined. He's just let out and he is just roaming around the detention center and spreading it to other people. But unfortunately, they didn't do anything about it. They honestly didn't even care. It was really, really sad.
That's really interesting that you're saying that he didn't really, in a way, he didn't think it was a big deal. Was that because you believe that he didn't have the right information? And like, what I'm trying to understand is, in the detention center, were they given enough information about the scale, the magnitude of the problem, or was it because like he probably came in just around the time when COVID-19 was starting to appear in the US, if I'm not mistaken. So maybe he was not aware, or maybe language barrier or other issues. But was there, do you believe, in your conversation with him, does he understand the, the magnitude of the problem? Does he understand the seriousness of COVID-19 here in the US?
No, he actually didn't at all for several reasons. One, because when he came here, there was supposedly no signs of COVID in Turkey. Two, when he was in the US, there was, according to our administration, like 10, 11 cases, and we had it under control. And then in the detention centers, the medical doctor that treated him told him that he's perfectly fine and it's not a big deal. And, he's going to recover and all of these positive aspects of it, as opposed to the severity of the virus, especially if you have underlying conditions, which some people really find out after they have COVID.
All right, and you said that you had another client that was his roommate. I want to talk about in general your clients. How how much at risk are they, and do you have any other client that have tested positive?
So currently, I have about 35 to 40 clients in detention. As soon as like there was a state of emergency declared in the US, I submitted petitions for every single one of them to have them released. Because the detention centers are overpopulated, there's no way that they can be social distancing. There's inadequate medical care. There's just so much wrong with the system, especially around immigration detention centers, that I knew the safest way for them at least was to at least get them out of detention so that they're home with their sponsors or somebody that was willing to let them stay with them. But my clients in San Diego, two of them were released on zero bonds, which was a relief. One of them, unfortunately, $15,000. But we've been getting better results because we are pushing the COVID agenda in the sense, I mean, these judges, they know themselves how crowded and like
Unsanitary the places.
yeah, exactly, the detention centers are.
So he is in detention center because there's a $15,000 bond, and the family is not able to come up with that price. Now, in the U.S., when COVID-19 became such a big issue, there has been some measures here and there, like in terms of businesses, in terms of hospitals. What about in detention centers? Have they, I mean, $15,000 at the time of COVID-19, where many people are kind of, concerned that people are losing their jobs. People have worries about saving their money. I mean, $15,000 is not a small amount for a family in the U.S. So COVID-19 hasn't kind of changed that process in terms of judges asking for less in terms of bonds.
Unfortunately not. I had argued that he is an indigent client and he like they don't really have that kind of money, but the judge found that $15,000 was enough money to secure him showing back up for court and continuing with the removal procedure.
So, Samira, I want to also spend a few minutes about the prisons in general. I know in recent days there has been some push for some sort of like even in countries like Turkey, prisons were kind of the detention centers, jails, and prisons. They try to release some people just because of the severity of the COVID-19 issues and the confined place that is in prisons and detention centers. What is the status here in the U.S.? What discussions are there for prison in terms of helping people there to stay away from COVID-19?
So there's two. So we have the detention center, which falls under the judiciary, and they have set the Immigration Custom Enforcement with a list of who can be eligible for release, like immediately. And that's people over 65, if you're pregnant, if you have underlying health issues, and then they have like a list of health issues that they consider to be severe. As far as the prisons, they have different standards, and it's really based off of the governor of that state. And it has been happening. There has been a lot of prisoners that are being released that are over 70. They have house arrests now. They have ankle bracelets, stuff like that. They're just trying to manage. But again, it's like two different departments.
Once someone tests positive for COVID-19 in detention centers, and what happens next? You mentioned quarantining, and then whatever other privileges they might have if they're not positive for COVID-19, do they lose those privileges in terms of like making phone calls and stuff like that? Because that's a big incentive for someone to hide if they have symptoms.
Well, it's not that they are going to lose their privilege, but they're just not going to be able to be out in the common areas where the telephones are, right? So if they do make a phone call, like my client right now that is tested positive for COVID, he's given the phone like once a day, and that's like for 2 minutes to just literally call me, check in, make sure everything's good, and then hangs up. But for a lot of other people, they just assume that they're going to be in there longer. But my worry is that these are asylum seekers that are in the US. They don't have health insurance in the US. We're exposing them to this virus. Eventually, they're going to be released. And what if it is a serious medical condition? Who is going to be responsible for their medical payments, for their hospital visits? So it's a very sad situation for everybody.
And when you're talking to these clients, do they talk about other Kurdish Bakuris or immigrants that are stuck in Mexico, and do they have contacts? Are the ones that stuck in Mexico, are they in any better situation, or because Mexico is also having some issues with COVID-19?
Yes. So the ones that are in Mexico, they just have no clue what's going on, right? Because it's just so hard to get the information. Nobody knows what source to trust. So they are stuck in a limbo. There were 3 Bakuris that were here in detention, but unfortunately for some, I still don't understand what reasons, they were deported back to Turkey. I'm assuming the administration used it under the pretext of COVID and protecting our national security against COVID. But there's still no news about that. But they were deported straight back to Turkey after 3 days of being here.
So let me understand this correctly. Did they have a chance to present their case to a judge, or the deportation just happened based on some officer's kind of decision saying you need to be deported?
Yes.
Is that common?
That's not common at all. I've been actually trying to get a hold of their paperwork ever since they were deported, just so I can get a better understanding. Because if that is what happened, that's a violation of international law. That's a violation of Committee Against Torture. There's a lot of laws being broken if that is what happened, where, I mean, according to them, again, this is just what they're saying, that they were like not conducted any interviews. ICE literally just bought their plane tickets, put them on a flight, and sent all three back.
So, Samira, we're all aware of some of the political issues in Turkey and some of the ways that Kurds are kind of facing uh, different levels of un, un, unfavoring treatments in Turkey. But those clients that you have here, what's the common kind of case that they or fear that they have for leaving Turkey to come here?
It's the same. I mean, it's based off of persecution. It's based off of, I have clients that are even afraid to say that they're Kurdish, because of what they've seen back in Turkey. I have clients that come straight from Southeast region, Bakur. I have clients that are Kurdish that grew up in Istanbul and Ankara that are here, that have this fear instilled in them because of the way that the government treats them, or because of the way that the media portrays them, and they feel that their life is at risk and they can't pursue any type of happiness or freedom in Turkey. So they really, I mean, they go on this horrible journey to get here. So they have, I mean, definitely they have strong cases.
And in the past couple of years, the U.S.-Turkish relationship, they've had some really, major fluctuations. Sometimes it was really sour, that relationship. But in your dealing with clients and the legal processing and the judicial process here, was there a difference when Turkish-U.S. relations were going bad? Because U.S. at some point were it, they almost got into a fight over like prisoners and prison. Americans being held prison there. They're aware of how journalists are treated. They're aware of how political dissent is treated in Turkey. And but what I'm asking is, do you see a fluctuation in the judicial system or judicial branch as well, or is it just the relationship between the executive branch between both countries?
So typically it's really just the executive branch between the administration here, administration in Turkey. But
I would say the executive branch here, not necessarily in Turkey, because in Turkey, whenever the relations with U.S. gets sour, sorry for interrupting, then the judicial branch is kind of corresponding to the Turkish executive branch. We saw that in the case of the U.S. pastor, other U.S. citizens. When the government is upset at the U.S., people get more severe punishments. When the government is not, but I'm assuming it's different here. U.S. is presumably a lot more democratic than Turkey.
yeah, so at least we like to think that they're a lot more democratic, but I've seen a big difference in the sense, it's not really influenced by the administration. Judges are just much more sympathetic towards the Kurdish issue, and they actually understand it much better, as opposed to ICE officers who have no clue, and asylum officers who really have no clue either. And it's like you have to pass those two hurdles before you can even get to an immigration judge. So it's like educating them as you go. But yeah, the judges are just much more sympathetic towards Kurds.
And but the good thing here is, as soon as an immigrant makes it to inside the U.S., supposedly the immigration officers or the border protection officers, they cannot just deport them unless in cases like those three Kurds, which you're still not sure of, but you've heard that was the case. So at least then, if that's the case, if under normal proceeding, then those immigrants will get a hearing by the judge, and then they can present their cases to the judges here, right?
Yeah, so unfortunately, that's also changed in the past few months. Currently, anybody that comes through Mexico or any, let's say Canada, they are no longer eligible for asylum. They're only eligible for withholding, which basically grants you nothing except a work permit to stay and live in America and work here. But you can never travel with the withholding. You cannot ever gain citizenship or a green card. You cannot leave the country. So it's a very, very watered down version of asylum, but it's because of Trump's agreement with Mexico to declare Mexico as a safe state. So they're saying, if your life is really that at risk, why did you not seek asylum in Mexico before coming to the U.S.?
And that's let's assume that's a legit question. Why do those immigrants that make it to Mexico just not stay in Mexico?
I think for various reasons, but mainly because it's more often that you will find a community, a Kurdish community, or I mean, I do have Turkish clients, a Turkish community, as opposed to in Mexico. I don't really know much about like the Mexican community. I don't really know about the different ethnic groups that live out in Mexico, but I don't think it's a very feasible thing for them. I think in their mind, at least, it's like if I'm going to take this risky journey to find safety, I'd rather have it be in America as opposed to Mexico, where you really hear about gangs and about corruption and about all these other things that take place.
They might as well be like Mexico with the corruptions with the government. Turkey may have a lot more leeway to deal with political dissent inside Mexico than in the U.S. We've seen the case with Fethullah Gulen, for example. Turkey has been pressuring U.S. for years now, and U.S. has not kind of given to Turkish demands. I'm not sure if that was in Mexico, that would have been the same case. So maybe some of those fears are also based on if I stay in Mexico, if Turkish government wants to come after me, it's a lot easier for the Turkish government to come after me in a state like Mexico.
No, that's actually a really great point. So yeah, extradition law might play a big role, but that's actually a really good point.
And Samira, so your clients in terms of, I'm not sure if you have clients, for example, from Iranian Kurdistan, but if you do have clients, or if you've dealt with clients from Iranian Kurdistan, in their cases, do they receive a more favorable kind of response from the U.S. Authorities, or how does that compare to, for example, a case from Turkey, or even if you have some from Syria, which is another hotbed of conflict now? How do they compare?
So currently, the clients that are from Rojava, they're usually already inside of the U.S. So it's an affirmative asylum process, and they have very, very strong cases for. Definitely, first reason is just because of our feud with Iran, no relations with Iran. The American people are just more sympathetic to Iranians that are trying to flee from the regime, and they have a better understanding as opposed to when you try to explain to them the oppression or the persecution that happens inside of Turkey.
Well, Samira, it was very, very informative talking to you. I always appreciate conversations with you. I think that's all the questions I had for you, unless there's something else that you want to add.
No, that's it. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thank you so much, and good luck with your clients, and good luck to your clients.